Welcome back to the Simulator series. In today's episode, we are going to be scripting the pet bank system. As always, if you guys do enjoy the video or it does help you out, make sure you smash the like button, also the subscribe button, and turn post notifications on so you get notified every time I upload a brand new Roblox development video. I also have a Patreon. If you guys like to support me and gain access to all the scripts and the game file that I make during this episode, there's a link down below the description, and you guys can go and check that out. With that being said, let's hop right into it. Before we hop into studio, you guys are going to want to actually go down below in the description of this video and click the link which takes you to this free Patreon post that everybody has access to and can download from. Inside of this Patreon post, you're going to want to click the assets.zip and download that file directly to your computer. Inside of the zip file contains a couple of different models that we're going to be using throughout the series. And the one that we're going to be wanting to add to our game today is actually the pet bank. Now we can easily add this model in the Roblox Studio by right-clicking on the workspace, clicking on insert from file, and then we'll select the pet bank file inside of our assets folder. And now that we've inserted that into our game, we can actually see the model right there. Let me go ahead and hide this GUI real quick. So we're going to go inside of the star GUI, inside of the pet bank, and set that to no longer be enabled. And now we can see that we actually have our pet bank model right here. Now, one of the more important things about this model is that you have a part inside of here called hitbox. And that is literally just a basic Roblox part. It's pretty much just a big square. And we're going to be using this part to detect whenever a player gets close enough to the pet bank that we should actually open up their GUI. So along with that part being inside of there, we also want to make sure that the primary part of this model is set to that hitbox. And that's pretty much all you need to know about this model. Now that you've got this model, you can place it anywhere that you want to. I'm just going to go ahead and throw it inside of our spawn area right there. And since I'm putting it inside of our spawn area, I'm also going to put this inside of the spawn folder as well. You can put as many of these models inside of your workspace as you want to, and you can have them inside of folders or even inside of folders inside of folders. It doesn't matter where they're stored as long as they're stored somewhere within inside of the workspace, and they're named pet bank exactly how we have it named. Cool. So now that we've added that model to our game, we can actually get around the scripting. Now, the first thing we're going to actually do is update the player's data. And to do this, we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the player data folder, and open up the template module script. Inside of here, we're going to want to go towards the bottom of our script inside of our template variable. And inside of here, we have pets set to a blank table. And directly after this, we're going to create a variable called pet bank. And we're also going to set that to a table as well, just like how we have pets. And now that we've added the pet bank to our player data, we can start actually working on the pet bank system itself. Next, what we're going to want to do is actually create a config module script for our pet bank system. So again, inside of the replicated storage, there's a configs folder. And inside of here, we have a couple of different module scripts. Let's just go ahead and throw in a brand new module script, and we're going to rename this to pet bank. Now, of course, inside of here, we're going to rename the variable, and that looks pretty good. Then towards the top of the script, we actually want to create a variable for the replicated storage. Now that we have the replicated storage, let's go ahead and create another variable called player data, and that's actually going to be inside of the replicated storage, inside of the player data, and we're going to get that template module script. The reason that we're getting that template module script is because we're going to create a couple of different functions inside of here, and we want to be able to use that player data type that's inside of the template. The next thing that we're going to want to do is create a variable called default max slots. And we're going to actually set this to 50. And this variable is actually going to be used to determine the amount of pets that a player should be able to store inside of their bank by default. So initially, when the player first joins the game, even though they haven't done anything, they should be able to store up to 50 pets inside of there. And then in the future, as they play the game, they might be able to unlock more slots, or they might be able to purchase a game pass and unlock them that way. And of course, there's other ways that they can increase their bank slots. So now that we've created that variable, let's go ahead and create a new function. This one is going to be called get max slots. And this is actually going to accept a player, which is of course a player, and data, which is of the type that's stored inside of our player data template. So there we go. Now the way this function is going to work is pretty similar to a lot of the functions that we've created inside of our pets config. So for example, we're going to create a variable inside of here called amount, and that's going to be set to default max slots. And then after this, we can add a little comment here and say add game passes here. So basically in the future, when we add game passes to our game, we can do some math based off if the player has purchased specific game passes, and then we'll increase the amount variable by however much we should if they've purchased a specific game pass or achieved something else in our game and other things like that. And then finally, what we're going to do is we're going to return the amount variable. So now we're pretty much done with that function, and we're going to want to create another one. This function is going to be called get amount of stored pets. And this is only going to accept data, which once again is going to be of the player data type. Now inside of here, we're of course going to create a variable called amount, and that's going to be equal to 0. Then what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to loop through all of the pets that are stored inside of the player's pet bank data. Now, if you guys have created the pet inventory system, we've done this plenty of times during that, and it's the exact same way. So we're going to say for UUID, comma pet instance in data.petBank. Do. And now every time we loop through one of these, we're going to add 1 to the amount variable. And then finally, at the end, we're going to return that amount variable after all that math has been completed. Cool. So now that that function's created, we're going to create one more function inside of here. This function is going to be called get open slots. And this is going to accept the player and the player's data as well. So player data, there we go. Now inside of here, we're going to want to create a variable called used slots. And that's actually going to be equal to petbank.get amount of stored pets. And we're going to want to pass through the player's data. And then we're going to want to create another variable called max slots slots, and that's of course going to be equal to petBank.getMaxSlots. And we're going to pass through the player and the player's data as well. And then finally, we're just going to return the max slots minus uSlots. And now that function is going to tell us how many available slots are inside of the bank, so we're able to determine how many pets the player is actually able to store inside of their bank without going over the limit. So now that we've created that config, the next thing that we're going to do is actually start scripting the system on the server side. So we're going to go inside of the server script service, and we're going to add a brand new script to this. We're then going to rename this to pet bank. Now inside of here, we want to make our standard variables, so we want to get the replicated storage and the server script service. From the replicated storage, we want to create a variable for our pets config as well as our pet bank config. And then for the server script service, we want to create a variable for the player data manager, and then we also want to create a variable called pets manager, which is actually going to be the pets module script inside of the server script service as well. Now there's one more variable that we want to create right now, and that's actually called remotes, and that's going to be equal to the replicated storage.remotes.pets, which is a folder inside of our remotes folder. Now that we've created that variable, that also reminds me we actually have to create two new remotes. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the remotes folder, and inside of the pets folder, and we're going to add a brand new remote event. Now the first remote is going to be called deposit pets, and then we're going to duplicate that, and then we're going to name the second one withdraw pets. Now that we've added both of those remote events to our game, we can go back inside of our script, and inside of here, we're going to actually get those remotes. So we're going to say remotes.depositPets.onServerEvent::connect, and now we're not going to connect that to anything yet, but then we're going to duplicate that line, and then instead of saying deposit pets, we're going to get the withdrawal pets remote event as well. Now that we've added both those remote events to the script, what we're then going to do is create a brand new function called deposit pets. Now the arguments of this function are first going to be the player. Now the second argument, which is actually going to be data provided by the client whenever they fire this remote event, that's actually going to be called pets, which is actually a table. Now just to give you a better understanding of how this pets table is actually going to be structured, it's simply going to be an array of strings. So it's not going to be a dictionary, and all we're going to do is on the client side, we're going to create a table of all the pets that we have selected to either deposit or withdraw from or to our bank. And once we compile that list of pet UUIDs, we're actually going to send that list to the server. And then once we send that to the server, we're going to say, hey, here's all the UUIDs of the pets either inside of our pet inventory or inside of our bank inventory, and we want to either withdraw or deposit them from one to the other. So this is how the table is actually going to be structured. Like I said, it's just going to be an array of strings, aka an array of UUIDs. Now that we more so understand how the table is actually going to be structured, let's continue creating this function. We're of course going to create a variable called profile, and that's going to be equal to the player data.profiles and index that with the player. Now, of course, if we're not able to find the profile, then we just want to return n and stop the function right there. Additionally, we want to create a variable called pet inventory, which is actually going to be the pet inventory of the player's data. So how we get that is we're going to go inside of the profile, and we're going to go inside of the data, and then we're going to get the pets table. After that, we want to create a variable called amount to deposit, and we're going to set that equal to 0. Then what we're going to do is we're going to actually loop through that table that the player has sent to us. So we're going to say for underscore comma UUID in pets do. Now inside of this for loop, we actually want to do two things. The first thing that we want to check is if the UUID of that pet exists inside of the player's pet inventory. So basically, if the player actually has that pet inside of their pet inventory. And how we're going to do this is we're going to say if not pet inventory, and then we're going to index that with the specific UUID. Then what we're going to do is we're going to return and stop the function right there. So basically, if the player has passed a UUID to us that does not actually exist inside of their pet inventory, then they might be trying to create their own pet or do some exploit or something like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to stop the function entirely right there, and we're not going to actually do anything. Now, of course, if the pet is inside of the player's inventory, then we're going to keep going through this for loop, and then what we want to do is we want to actually add 1 to our amount to deposit variable. And now once that for loop has actually completed, we then want to check the amount to deposit variable, and we want to see if that equals 0. Now, if that equals 0, then we want to actually stop the function right there because the player does not have any pets to actually deposit. They just sent us a blank table. Now that we've checked both of those things, the next thing we want to do is create a variable called open bank slots, and that's going to be equal to pet bank config.get open slots, and then we're going to pass to the player and the profile.data. Now that we've determined the amount of pets that the player is allowed to deposit into their bank, we then need to check if the amount to deposit is greater than the open bank slots. And if it is, then we want to return n and stop the function right there because the player is trying to deposit too many pets when they don't have enough space. So now that we've gone through all of our checks, the next thing that we're going to do is create a variable called pet instances, which is actually going to be equal to a blank table. Now, once again, we're going to loop through all the pets that the player is requesting to deposit. So now what we're going to do inside of here is actually transfer the pet from the player's inventory inventory into their bank data. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable called pet instance, and that's going to be equal to the pet inventory, and then we're going to find that pet inside of there, so we're going to say UUID. Now that we found that pet, one of the first things that we want to make sure of is that the pet is not equipped. So we basically want to equip that for the player. So we're going to say petsmanager.unequip pet. We're going to pass through the player, and then we're going to pass through the UUID. So now that we've made sure that the pet has been unequipped, the next thing we're going to do is actually update the player's pet bank data. So we're going to go inside of the profile, inside of the data, inside of the pet bank table, and then we're going to index that with the UUID, and we're going to set that equal to the pet instance. So now we've just added that pet instance from the pet inventory into the pet bank. We still have not actually removed that pet instance from the pet inventory, so now we basically have a clone of that pet inside of the pet bank, and now we have to remove that from the player's pet inventory. Before we do that though, we're going to actually add the instance to our pet instances table. So we're going to say pet instances, index this with the specific UUID, and then we're going to set that equal to the pet instance. And now that we've added that pet instance to the pet instances table, the next thing that we want to do is, like I said, delete that pet from the player's pet inventory. Now, to be able to actually delete this pet, we have to make a change inside of our pet module. So inside of the server script service, we want to open up that pets module script, and inside of here, we want to find the delete pet function that we have right here. What we're going to do is we're going to actually just copy and paste this function, and then we're going to rename one of them to force delete pet. Now, the only change that we actually want to make to this is we're saying if pet locked, then return. We just actually want to remove this line entirely. The reason that we need to move that line is because if the pet is locked, we can't actually use the delete pet method on the pet because it will not be deleted. So we're creating this force delete pet so that on the server side, we can call this function and that will 100% delete the pet. There's many different ways to do this. We didn't need to recreate a function. We could have even added an additional argument onto this function by saying force, which would have been a boolean. And based on this force argument, we could have made a change right here as well. There's so many different things that we could have done. I just felt like going with this function was one of the better options, so that's why I picked it. Now that we've created that function, let's go back to our pet bank script, and inside of here, we're going to go ahead and call the pets manager, and then we're going to call the force delete pet method. We're going to pass through the player as well as the UUID. Cool, so now we've pretty much done all of the work. The last thing that we actually have to do is fire our remote. So we're going to say remotes.deposit pets, fire client. We're going to pass through the player, and then we're going to pass through the pet instances as well. So just to kind of recap on this function real quick, on the client side, we're going to fire the deposit pets remote event. And when we fire that remote event, we're going to pass through this pets argument, which is going to be a table or an array of strings. And those strings are going to be UUIDs of the pets that are currently stored inside of our inventory that we want to deposit into the bank. So one of the first things that we're going to do inside of this function is we're going to actually loop through the table that the player passes to us. Now, as we loop through the table, we're checking to see if the UUID actually exists inside of the player's pet inventory. So if they actually own that specific pet. And additionally, if they do own that pet, then we're going to add +1 to the amount to deposit variable. The reason that we're using this variable is because imagine if a player passes us a blank table. That should not happen, but if it did, we want to stop the function right here so nothing goes wrong. Then after that, we're figuring out how many pets the player can actually deposit into their bank, and we're checking if the amount of pets that the player wants to deposit into their bank is greater than the amount that they actually can. And if the amount is greater, then we're going to stop the function right there because we don't want the player to deposit more pets than the limit we have set. And after we do all those checks, we actually finally get down to the work of adding all those pets from our pet inventory over to our pet bank, and then we fire the remote at the end, notifying the client that, hey, we did just make that transfer. Now that that function has been created, we can actually connect the deposit pets function to the deposit pets remote event. Next, what we're going to do is actually just copy and paste this function, and then we're going to rename the bottom one to withdraw pets. Now inside of this function, we're going to do a lot of the same stuff. First of all though, this pet inventory variable is going to change. Instead of getting the pet inventory, we actually want to get the pet bank. And that's of course inside of data.pet bank. And then for this amount to deposit variable, we actually want to change this from deposit to withdraw. So now we'll update that variable in all these different locations. And now that we've updated that variable, we also want to update the pet inventory variable. So instead of saying pet inventory, we're going to say pet bank. So this is again pretty much the exact same as our deposit function. But when we go to withdraw, we of course need to check through the pet bank instead of checking through the pet inventory. We're still going to go through the same checks. So we're going to check if the player actually owns those pets or if those pets are actually stored inside of the player's pet bank. Additionally, if the player has passed us a blank table that we don't want to do anything. Now we also want to update the open bank slots variable because instead of checking the bank slots that are available, we actually want to check the player's pet inventory slots that are available. Now, unfortunately, inside of our pets config, we actually haven't created the function called get open slots inside of there to make the math simpler. So what we're going to do is actually create that. Inside of the replicate storage, we're going to go inside of the configs folder and open up the pets module script. Right between the get total stored pets and the get max stored pets, I'm going to create a brand new function. And this is of course going to be called get open slots. Now this is going to accept a player, which is of course going to be a player, and their data. And we're going to create this basically the exact same way that we did with the pet bank. So we're going to say used slots equals pets.get total stored pets, and we're going to pass through the data. And then we're going to create another variable called max slots, and that's going to be equal to pets.get max stored pets. And of course, we're going to pass through the data once again. And then finally, what we're going to do is we're going to return max slots minus used slots, just like that. So cool. Now that we've created that method inside of our pets config, we can go back to the pet bank, and right here inside of the withdrawal function, instead of saying pet bank config.get open slots, we can say pets config.get open slots, and once again pass through the player and pass through the profile.data. We'll also rename this variable as well. So instead of open bank slots, we'll say open pet slots, and then we want to update that variable right there as well. Cool. So after we check if the amount to withdraw is greater than the amount of open pet slots, then we actually start doing the work of transferring the pets from the player's bank to the player's inventory. Now again, we do a lot of the same stuff, but inside of here, instead of unequipping the pet, what we actually want to do is give the player the pet. So we're going to actually call that give pet method. We're going to pass to the player, and then we're going to pass to the pet instance as well. Additionally, we need to set the UUID inside of the pet bank to nil, and that's effectively deleting the pet from the player's pet bank. And then the last thing we want to do is put the pet instance inside of the pet instances table, just like we did right here. And then finally, at the end of this function, the last thing that we want to do is actually fire the withdraw pets remote event, passing through the player and the pet instances, just like we did for the deposit function. So now that we've created that function, we're going to go ahead and connect our withdraw pets remote event to that function, just like that. Now we're pretty much completely done on the server side, so we can close out of that script, and we can even close up the server script service. The next thing that we're going to do is actually update our state manager. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the client folder, and open up the state module script. Inside of here, we're going to go down towards the bottom of our script, and we're just going to go ahead and copy one of these remote events. And for instance, right here, instead of using the index pet remote event, we're actually going to be using the deposit and withdrawal remote events. So first we'll do deposit. Of course, we're going to say .onClientEvent, connect that to an anonymous function. And the argument here is actually going to be pets, which is once again going to be a table. Now, what we're going to want to do inside of the state manager is we actually need to update the state that's currently on the client. So whenever the player deposit pets on the client side, we actually have to add all of those pets to the player's state. So how we're going to do that is we're going to loop through the pets table that gets sent to us. So of course, for UUID, comma pet instance in pets do, and then we want to go inside of the player data, inside of the pet bank table, and then we want to index that with the UUID and set that equal to the pet instance. If you guys are confused by this at all, remember, before this remote event is actually fired on the server side, we basically do all of this already on the server side. So remember how we go inside of the player's profile, inside of their data, inside of the pet bank table, and then index that with the specific UUID and set that equal to the pet instance? We do that on the server side, but that's not automatically replicated to the client side. So the client does not actually know about that. That's why with this remote event, we're sending through a table of UUIDs and pet instances so that we can easily do this on the client side. So now that we've updated the state for when we deposit pets, we also want to do the same thing for when we withdraw pets as well. So let's go ahead and copy and paste that, and this time we'll say withdraw pets. Now when we withdraw pets, we actually want to remove that pet from the pet bank. So all we have to do is instead of saying set this to the pet instance, we're going to set that to nil. Cool. So now whenever we deposit or withdraw pets, the state on our client side will be updated entirely. Now that we've done that, we can go ahead and close out of the state module script. Now before we can start scripting the GUI, what we want to do is create a brand new module script where we're going to store a couple of different functions that are going to be used by both the pet inventory system as well as the pet bank system. Now, comparing the pet inventory GUI to the pet bank GUI, they share a couple of different similarities. For instance, the way that they display pets are exactly the same. So for example, this little square right here, how the pet is generated and shown right here, is exactly the same thing that we want to do inside of the pet bank. So for example, we have the viewport frame. Inside of that, we have the pet model, and then we also display the power of the pet's name, as well as if it's equipped and other things like that. This exact thing is how we also want it to look like in our pet bank system. Additionally, our pet bank system also has a search bar. So whenever we search up a pet, we want to be able to type out its name and find that pet inside of our inventory. The functionality of the search bar is the exact same that we want to be able to do inside of the pet bank system as well. So that's why we're going to create a module script to put both those functions inside of so that the pet inventory can share the same code as the pet bank as well. It's way better to create functions inside of a module script that you can share rather than copying and pasting one function to another script, because then if you ever need to make changes to them, you need to make changes in multiple locations rather than just making them in one. So to create this module script, we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of our client folder, and we're going to add a brand new module script. Now we're going to rename this to pet utils, and then inside of here, we of course want to update that variable. So pet utils, and now we actually have to get the function. So let's go inside of the starter player, inside of the starter player scripts, open up the GUI folder, open up the pet's inventory local script, and inside of here, we want to find our generate pet function. Now with this function, we're going to take all the code down to this line right here. So we're going to go ahead and copy that, and then inside of the pet utils module script, we're going to paste that directly inside of here. Let's say end so that that's like a valid function, and then instead of saying local function, we're just going to say function pet utils.generate pet. And now from that, we need to create a couple of more variables inside of here as well. We could grab those variables directly from our pet inventory. So So let's go ahead and just copy like most of these variables because I think we'll need them, and then we'll just delete the ones that we don't need. So we don't need the players variable, and we don't need the state manager variable, but we need all the other ones. So the viewport model, the format number, and the pets config as well. Now, to be able to make this function more modular, we have to change some of the arguments. So let's think, how can we actually make this function compatible for both our pet inventory and our pet bank system? How do we need to set this function up so that this function can be used by both of those scripts? Well, first of all, when we're calling this function, we're going to be able to pass a text bond through them. That's going to be our template. So we're going to create an argument right here called template, and that's going to be of type text button. Now, what we're actually going to use the template for is right here, where we create our clone variable. So instead of saying pet template clone, we're going to clone the template that's passed through to this function. Additionally, we have this container variable right here, which doesn't actually exist, and we need to create that as well. So we'll pass through the container to this function as well, which is going to be a scrolling frame in both these instances, and then we can update that variable. And then finally, the last thing that we actually need to pass through here is the specific pet, so that this function can run through and do everything it needs to do to display that specific pet. So we're going to say pet, and that's going to be of the pets config.pet instance type. And now that we've done that, we're pretty much completely done with this function. So inside of this function, we still clone that. We then parent that to the container like we always do. We make sure that we set it to visible. We update its name to the specific UUID. We update the display of the pet's name, and then also if it's equipped, as well as its clicks power. Then we get the model and add that to the viewport frame. And then finally, at the end of this, the final thing that we want to do is actually return the clone. And the clone is going to be a text bond. So now that we've created that method inside of here, let's go back to the pet's inventory. And inside of here, towards the top, we actually want to create a variable for the pet utils. So we're going to say pet utils, and that's going to be equal to the replicated storage.client.pet utils. And now that we've created that variable, let's go back down to the generate pet function. Now inside of here, what we're going to do is basically delete all of these lines of code, just leaving that variable creation and the clone.mousebond one click as well. Now, instead of the clone variable being set to the pet template clone, we're going to actually use the pet utils module, and we're going to use that generate pet function that we just created. And now what we're going to do is we're going to pass through the pet template variable as well as the container variable, and then finally the actual pet. And then once we do all that, we're going to generate that, and then the clone variable is going to be set to that. And since this variable is just set to that ordinary text bond that we were using previously, we can still call .mousebond one click on this and do anything that we need to. Additionally, we should probably rename this variable. Instead of calling it clone, we should probably call it something like button, because that makes a little bit more sense now. And there we go. Now, there's actually one more function apart from the generating pets that we want to add to the pet utils. And like I said, that's the search function. So we want to come down to our update search pets function that we have right here. And what we're going to do is basically copy this entire function, go back to our pet utils module script, and we're going to paste that inside of here as well. Now, of course, we want to update this. Instead of being a local function, it's going to be a method of our pet utils module script. And now we have to accept a couple of different arguments so that we can update some of the variables inside of here. So the first argument that we're going to create is called search bar, and that's going to be a text box. Now that we have that argument, we're going to update the search variable inside of here. So we're going to say search bar.text instead of search. The second argument that we want to add is actually the table of pets that we can loop through. So we're going to say pet table, and that's just going to be a table. And with the pet table variable, we can actually replace state manager.getData.pets right here. And the reason that we're doing that is because, like I said, this function is going to be shared between the pet inventory and the pet bank. When we work with the pet bank, we can not only search through the player's pet inventory, we sometimes need to search through the pet's bank inventory as well. So that's why with this function, we want to be able to provide it a different table depending on what we want to do. Now, finally, we have one more variable right there called container, and that's what we're going to accept here as well. So container, and that's going to be a scrolling frame. And now that we've got that argument, we can go ahead and update that variable right here. And now that's all good to go. So now that we've added that function right there, we can actually delete that function entirely. And now anywhere we actually see an error inside of our script, we can actually just replace that function. So coming down to search.change, we actually want to create an anonymous function inside of here. And then we can call the pet utils.update search pets. We're going to pass through the search bar, and then we'll pass through the table of pets that we want to look through, which is going to be the pets inside of our state manager. And then we'll also pass through the container as well. And now that we've done that right there, we can just copy and paste that right here. And now that function is all good to go. So now that we've extracted both those functions and put them inside of a module script so that we can use with the pet bank system, we can now close out of the pet's inventory because we're completely done with that. And now we can actually get around the scripting the pet bank GUI. So inside of the GUI folder, inside of the started player, inside of the started player scripts, we're going to add a brand new local script to this, and we're going to rename this to pet bank. Now, of course, inside of the script, we got to create a lot of the variables that we normally do. I'm just going to steal a bunch of them from the pet inventory script. We're going to copy a bunch of these variables, and then we'll just delete the ones that we don't need. So we're going to paste them inside of here. Now, we do need the workspace, we do need the replicated storage, and we do need the player service, but we do not need the viewport model module. We don't need the format number module, but we do need the state manager. We also need the pet utils, and instead of the pets config, we actually need the pet bank config. So we'll create a variable for that, just like that. And then we also have the remotes variable as well, which we'll of course need. We then have the player GUI. Now we don't actually need the left GUI right here, so we can go ahead and close that. Then we have our GUI variable right here, which instead of being set to the pet inventory, we actually want to set to the pet bank. And then we have a variable called frame, which is correct as well. In addition to these variables, we want to create a few more variables for different elements of the GUI. So the first one we're going to create is for the container, and that's of course going to be inside of the frame. Then we want to create a variable called search. That's going to be again inside of the frame. We'll then create a variable for the buttons frame, which is of course going to be inside of the frame once again. And then we'll create a variable called by slots, which is actually the text button inside of the frame as well. So there we go. After that, we have the amount text label that we're going to want to update occasionally. So that's also inside of the frame. And then we also have the info text label as well, which is inside of the frame. Lastly, we have the exit button, which is also inside of the frame. There we go. Now, another thing with how the system is going to work is that our bank is going to have different modes. So of course, there's going to be withdrawal, there's going to be deposit, and then there's going to be no mode, which basically means that the player is at the main bank menu and hasn't selected a mode yet. And we're going to actually create a variable for that. So we're going to create a variable called mode, which is not going to be set to anything. Above this, we're going to create a type called mode, and we're going to set that equal to the different modes that it could possibly be. The first mode is of course going to be deposit. The second mode is going to be withdrawal, and the third and final mode is going to be nil, because sometimes a variable is not going to be set to anything. Now that we've created that type, we want to set our mode variable to the type of mode, just like that. So now we'll update that variable whenever we actually play around or change the mode. And additionally, we want to create a variable called selected pets, which is just going to be equal to a blank table. We'll of course use this variable whenever we select pets to deposit or withdraw to or from our bank. Now the first thing that we're going to start scripting is actually not GUI related. It's more so related to the models / pet bank parts that are inside of our workspace that whenever a player gets close enough to, we want to display the GUI. So what we're going to do is create a function called setUpModels. Now it's not going to accept any arguments. And what we're going to do inside of this function is we are going to loop through all of the descendants inside of the workspace. So we're going to say workspace.getDescendants, do. And now as we're going through all of the descendants inside of the workspace, we want to check the name of the descendant. And if that's equal to pet bank, then we know that we found our pet bank model. Now the important thing here is that the string that you set right here has to match the exact same string of the name of the pet bank model that you've now put inside of your workspace. Now that we know that we found the specific model, what we're then going to do is we're going to say descendant.primaryPart.touched, and then we're going to connect that to an anonymous function. Now of course the first argument of this function is going to be other part, and now whenever this part is actually touched, what we want to do, we're going to create a new variable called player, and that's going to be equal to players semicolon get player from character, and then we're going to pass through the other part dot parent. Now if we do find a player and that player is equal to our local player, then what we want to do is we want to display the GUI. So we're going to say GUI.enabled, and we're going to set that equal to true. Now that we've created that function, we can just go ahead and make sure that we call that somewhere inside of the script. So whenever the player first joins the game, this function is going to run. It's just going to go through all of the things that are inside of our workspace. It's going to find our specific model that we're looking for, and every single time it finds that model, what it's going to do is it's going to listen for that touched event connected to this function right here. And what this function is going to do is it's basically going to listen for whenever this specific player, this specific client actually touches the pet bank. And when the player touches that pet bank model, then we want to make that GUI appear, and that's what it does right here. Now that we've set up actually displaying the GUI to the player, we can move on to scripting the GUI itself. So to begin actually scripting the GUI, the first thing that we're going to start scripting is selecting a mode for our bank, aka either depositing or withdrawing. Let's first actually get those buttons and kind of set them up. So we're going to say buttons.mode, and then we're going to get the withdrawal button. We're going to say mouse button one click, and then we're going to connect that to an anonymous function. Cool. So now we've gotten the withdrawal button, and whenever we actually click that, we also want to do the same thing for the deposit button. So now we've got both those buttons added right here. The next thing we're going to want to actually do is create a function called select mode, and the argument of this function is of course going to be mode, which is going to be of the mode type. Now whenever we click any of these buttons, one of the first things that we want to do is we want to make sure that we actually update our mode variable right here with the new mode that we just changed to. Now the next thing that we want to do is start updating the visibility of some of our elements in this GUI based on what mode the player is actually in. Now I'm going to actually enable this GUI so it's much more easier to visualize and understand exactly what we're doing and why we're going through this process. So whenever a player selects a mode, whether that be deposit or withdrawal, we no longer want this info text label to actually be displayed to the player. We only want this info text label to be displayed to the player if they're not in either of the withdrawal or deposit modes. So going back to our script inside of the select mode function, we're going to say info label dot .visible equals not mode. So if deposit or withdrawal is passed through to this function, then the info label is no longer going to be visible. But if nothing is passed through to this function, meaning that there is no mode selected, then this text label will become visible again. In addition to that, inside of the buttons frame, we have the mode frame right here, which holds all the buttons for selecting either the deposit or withdrawal mode. When a player selects a mode, we don't actually want those buttons to be displayed because the player used those buttons, so they should no longer be displayed. So what we're going to do is we're going to say buttons.mode.visible equals not mode. So we only want to display those buttons if no mode is selected. Now on the opposite end, we have the action frame right here, which displays all the action buttons that a player can perform when they have actually selected a mode. So we want to display that whenever a player selects a mode. So we're going to say buttons.action.visible equals mode. Now another thing is that we have this text button called by slots, and we only want to display that if the player has not selected a mode. So we're going to say by slots.visible equals not mode as well. Now going back to whenever a player selects a mode, in addition to displaying the action buttons, we also want to display the container as well. So we're going to say container.visible equals mode. And then we also wanted to display the search bar as well if the player selects a mode. Now for the container, I'm not sure how I accidentally said vector2.init16. Instead, we should say visible, and let's copy and paste that right there. So now that's good for both by slots and container. So now that we've added all of this current logic to this function, let's go back down to where we listen to whenever a player clicks on the withdrawal or deposit button. And we actually want to call the select mode button. Of course, when we click the withdrawal button, we want to call that function with the withdrawal argument. And then when we click the deposit button, we want to call the function with the deposit argument. Now, another thing that we want to do, just so that we can quickly test this out, is inside of the buttons frame, we have the mode frame right here, and we want to make sure that that's set to visible by default because this is what the GUI is supposed to look like whenever the player first opens up the GUI. In addition to that, we also want to make the container not visible as well because no container should be displayed until the player selects either of the modes. And finally, the same can be said for the search bar as well, so let's make that not visible. Cool. So now as soon as we load into our game, we're met with the withdrawal or deposit button. Let's go ahead and click on withdrawal. When we click on withdrawal, we can actually see that the container becomes visible. We can see that the right buttons are now shown and the search bar is visible right here as well. So that's all working perfectly. Now the next thing we want to do is create the function for displaying all the pets inside of the container. We want to do this whenever a player selects a mode. So what we're going to do is create a new function called generate container. Now each time we generate the container, we also want to clean the container to remove all the pets which are currently displayed inside of it. So we're going to create another function real quick called clean container. And to just quickly clean the container, what we're going to do is we're going to loop through all the children inside of the container. Now, if the child is a text button and the child is not named template, then what we're going to do is we're going to destroy the child, just like that. So we're basically going to destroy all of the unused text buttons, only leaving the template one behind so we can continue using it. And like I said, that's the first thing that we're going to do whenever we generate a new container is first we're going to clean it and then we're going to actually start generating it. Now to begin actually generating the container, we first want to create a variable called pets, and that's going to be equal to a table of the pets. Now this table can either be the player's pet inventory or it can be the player's pet bank inventory. And how we're going to decide that is based off of our mode variable. So if the mode is set to deposit, then where do we want to look? Well, we actually want to look inside of the player's pet inventory. So we're going to go inside of the state manager, inside of get data function, and then we want to get the pets table. Now if the mode is set to withdrawal, then we want to look inside of the pet bank. So we're going to say state manager.getData.pet bank. Cool. So now that we figured out what pets we actually want to look through, we now have to generate and display those pets to the player. So we're going to loop through all those pets, UUID, comma, pet instance in pets do. We're going to go ahead and create the pet button by using the pet utils module. So we'll say generate pet. We're going to pass through the container.template for the template. We're going to pass through the container for the container, and then we're going to pass through the pet instance for the pet. Now, additionally, something that the pet inventory doesn't actually display is if a pet is selected or if it's locked. So since those image labels are not a part of the pet inventory, we actually have to do that work right here because otherwise the generate pet function would not be as module considering those things are not in both of these. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable called selected image, and that's going to be equal to pet button find first child selected. The reason that we have to use find first child on the pet button is because selected is actually a property of all text buttons and a lot of instances in Roblox, so you can't actually say dot selected because that would refer to the property, not the child. That's why we have to use find first child. Anyways, now that we've gotten that image, what we're then going to do is we're going to set the visibility of it to false by default. Now additionally, inside of the pet button, we also have an image label called locked, and we want to set the visibility of that equal to pet instance dot locked. So if the pet is locked, then the locked image should be visible so that the player knows this. And now in that short amount of code, we've pretty much done everything that we need to do to actually display the pet to the player in the GUI. The next thing we want to do is listen for whenever this button is actually clicked. So we're going to create an anonymous function inside of here. And of course, whenever a pet is clicked inside of this GUI, we want to be able to select that pet so that we can choose to either deposit or withdraw that pet. So because of that, we're going to create a new function called select pet. This is going to accept a UUID, which is of course going to be a string. Now the first thing we want to do with this function is we want to actually see if the pet is already selected, because if it's selected, then we want to deselect the pet. And how we're going to tell if it's already selected is we're going to say table.find, and then we're going to look through the selected pets table, and we're going to try to find that specific UUID. Then we want to create a variable called pet button, which is going to be equal to container find first child, and we're going to look through the container and try to find that UUID. And additionally, we need to create that selected image variable up here again, because whenever we select or deselect a pet, we want to update that image's visibility. So now that we have that image, we're going to say selected image dot visible equals not is selected. So basically, if the pet is already selected, then the image will no longer be visible, and if the pet has not been selected yet, then the image will become visible. We're then going to say if the pet is selected. Now, if the pet is selected, then we basically want to deselect it, and how we're going to do that is we're going to say table.remove, and we're going to remove the index of that UUID from the selected pets table. Now inside of here, you can actually put UUID because that's not how arrays work. Earlier, when we created the isSelected variable, we actually used table.find, and what table.find actually does is it returns a number for the position inside of the array where that UUID is. So since we've got that position, we need to actually use that number to be able to find it and remove it from the selected pets table. So now that we're removing selected pets from the table, we also want to add the pet to the table if it has not been selected. So we're going to say table.insert. We want to insert it to the selected pets table, and we want to insert that specific UUID just like that. So now we're pretty much done with the select pet function. We can go back down to wherever we actually click on the function to select or deselect the pet, and then we can call the select pet function. And of course, we want to pass through the UUID to that function whenever we click on the button. So we definitely have some more work to do with the pet button, but since we just created all this logic, let's actually go ahead and test it out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to select mode, and inside of here, we want to check if the mode has been selected. So if deposit or withdrawal have been selected, then what do we want to do? Well, we want to go ahead and generate that container to display to the player. Now that we're calling that function, we can actually go ahead and test this out. So to test this out, make sure that you actually have some pets in your pet inventory, and then we can click on deposit pets. And when we click on that, we can actually see that all of our pets are displayed right here. We can also see the pets that we have equipped as well as the ones that are locked too. Now, if we go ahead and click on a pet, we can actually see that a check mark is appearing / disappearing if we select or unselect that pet, which is great. From this though, we can actually see that there are a few things that we need to update. First of all, the withdraw button should not say withdraw one pet. It should say how many pets we actually have selected, and if we don't have any selected, it should say something different entirely. So to begin working on that logic, we're going to go ahead and create another function. This function is going to be called update action button. Inside of this function, we're going to create a variable called amount, which is going to be equal to hashtag selected pets. That's going to give us the amount of elements that are inside of our array, so we can easily find out how many pets we have selected. Now, based on the amount that we actually have selected, we want to update the action button's text and the background color as well. So we're going to say buttons.action.text equals. Now, if the amount equals 0, then we want this to say mode pets. So by default, without any pets being selected, it should just say deposit pets or withdraw pets. Now, alternatively, if we actually have a pet selected, then what we want this to say is mode space amount space pets. So if we have any pet selected, what this will actually say is either withdraw or deposit 1 pets or deposit 5 pets or something like that. If we don't have any pets selected, then the button should just say withdraw pets. Now that we have that text all set up, we can then go ahead and work on its background color. So we're going to say background color 3 equals, if the amount equals 0, then we actually want to set it to a gray color. So we're just going to say 0, 0, 0, and then we can adjust this, and then we want that to be like a gray color, sort of like that. Otherwise, we want it to be that nice blue color that we're using by default. And let's go ahead and grab that color right there and paste it directly like that. So there we go. So if the player has 0 pets selected, then it's going to be a gray button. But if the player does have some pets selected, then it'll be that nice blue color. Okay, cool. So we're pretty much done with the functionality. Let's go back down to where we actually work with selecting pets. And right here, whenever we actually select a pet, we also want to call the update action button after we select the pet, just like that. In addition to updating the action buttons whenever we select a pet, we also want to update those action buttons before we generate the container as well. So we're going to go ahead and call that inside of the select mode function right there, just like that. Okay, cool. So we can go ahead and once again test this out. Let's go ahead and select deposit pets. When we go into here, we can see the button is gray and says deposit pets. When we select the pet, we can now see that it gets updated and it's now blue and says deposit 1 pets. If we keep clicking, we can see that the number is updating as I select or deselect pets, and let's select 0, and now we can see it goes back to that So that's working perfectly. Let's then go ahead and set up the functionality of selecting all pets. So we're going to say buttons.action.select all.mouse button one click, connect, and an anonymous function inside of here. Whenever we select all pets, what we actually want to do first is reset all the pets that we currently have selected. And how we can do this is really simple. All we're going to do is say selected pets, and we're going to set that variable to just a blank table. Now that's really simple and all, but I think it might be worthwhile to just create this into its own function so that it stands out a little bit more as to exactly what we're doing. So we're going to create a function called reset selected pets, and inside of here, that's what we're going to do. We're going to set the selected pets just to a blank table, just like that. So coming back down here, instead of resetting the pets this way, we're going to actually call that function. Now, after we reset those selected pets, we then want to create a variable called pets, and now we need to determine if we should be looking inside of the player's inventory or inside of the player's bank. So it's identical to exactly what we do when we generate the container. So we can literally just copy that line of code and paste that right down to here. Now, after we figure out what pets we actually want to look at, we then are going to start looping through them. So we're going to say for UUID, comma, pet instance in pets do. And then all we're going to do is call select pet on that specific pet, pass through the UUID. And then finally, once we're done selecting all those pets, we want to call the update action button function so that it updates that button with all the pets that we now have selected. So we can go ahead, save that, and test that out. Once we get into our game, we can go ahead, go into deposit pets, click on a couple of pets. We see that that's all working perfectly. We can click select all, and we can now see that all of our pets are selected, and it says deposit 100 pets right here. Now, if we deselect any of these, then that also updates the action label as well. So that's all working perfectly. Now that we scripted the select all button, let's go ahead and script another button. This time, we're actually going to script the cancel button. Now, the cancel button is really simple, and whenever a player actually clicks this, all we want to do is call the select mode function and not pass through any arguments. So whenever we click the cancel button, that'll basically reset the GUI and take us back to this main screen right here. Something else that we haven't actually touched on yet is this amount text label right here. We always want to update this amount text label to display how many pets are currently stored inside of the bank, as well as the max amount of pets that the player can store inside of the bank. So to do that, what we're going to do is right above our setup models function, we're going to create a brand new function called update amount. Now with this function, we're going to create a variable called stored pets, and that's going to be equal to pet bank config.get amount of stored pets, and we're going to pass through the state manager.get data. Additionally, we want to create a variable called max stored pets, and that's going to be equal to pet bank config.get max slots, and we'll pass through the player as well as the state manager.get data. So now that we figured out how many pets we currently have stored and the max amount of pets that we currently have stored, we can then use that information to update the text label. So to update the amount text label, we'll say .text, and now what we're going to set the text to is the stored pets slash, and then we'll display the max stored pets directly next to it. And then after that, we're going to say pet slots used, just like that. Now that we've created that function, let's actually use it. And when are we going to actually use that function? Well, we're actually going to call that function when the script starts up. So we're just going to throw it right below when we call the setup models function. And let's actually move these function calls to the very bottom of our script just to keep everything organized. Now, another thing that we have to script is the actual search bar. So to script the search bar, we're going to say search.search to get the actual text box. And then we're going to listen to the changed event. Now, anytime this is changed, what we're going to do is we're going to get our pets table. And we're going to get the pets table the same way that we do every other time. So based on the mode, we'll either get the pets data or the pet bank data. And then after we get the pets table, we can then use the pet utils module and use the update search pets function. And then we're going to pass through the actual search bar. So search.search, and then we'll pass through the pets table, and then we'll also pass through the container as well, just like that. Now you might be thinking there's probably some other stuff that we also have to do with the search bar, but no, that's it. That's literally all the code that we actually have to type out to actually script the search bar. It's super simple, super easy, because we've put most of the code logic inside of the module. Now that we've gotten that search bar set up, let's actually set up the action button, and the action button refers to the button that we click whenever we want to deposit or withdraw our pets. So we're going to say buttons.action.mouse button one click, connect, and then we'll create an anonymous function inside of here. Now, whenever we actually click the action button, the first thing that we want to do is we want to make sure that we actually have some pets selected. So if the amount of selected pets equals 0, then we just want to stop the function right there and do nothing. After that, we want to create a variable for the specific remote, because remember, we have both the withdrawal and the deposit remote. So we're going to check if the mode equals deposit, then the remote that we want to use is remotes.depositPets. But if the mode is withdrawal, then we want to use the withdrawal remote. And now that we figured out which remote we're going to use, what we're then going to do is call fire server, and we're going to pass through all the pets that we actually have selected. So now that we're able to tell the server, hey, we want to deposit or we want to withdraw these specific pets, the next thing that we actually have to do is listen to those remote events that are going to be fired back to us so that we can actually update the GUI. So below our search bar logic, what we're going to do is we're going to say remotes.withdrawalPets.onClient event, and then we're going to connect that to an anonymous function, and this anonymous function is going to have a pets argument. Then what we're going to do is we're going to say task.type delay. We're going to wait 0 seconds. And remember, we need to do this because we're using our state manager. And then inside of this anonymous function, what do we want to do? Well, first of all, we want to reset the selected pets. That's the first thing that we want to do. After we reset the selected pets, the next thing we want to do is regenerate the container. So we're going to call generate container. The reason we're calling generate container is because we want to basically update the container GUI with all the pets that have been removed and only display the pets that should be displayed. After we do that, we also want to call the update amount function so that we can actually update that amount text label if it needs to be updated. And then the last thing that we want to do is call the update action button, because now that we've deselected all of the pets that we had already selected, we also need to update that action button because the action has been performed. And now that we've done that, what we can do is literally just copy and paste this. And of course, instead of saying withdraw pets, we can say deposit pets this time and have the exact same logic right here. So now with all that being said, we can hop into our game and test this out. Cool. So we've now scripted most of the logic to the pet bank system. We pretty much just have to do a couple more tiny things. One of the things that we haven't done so far is scripting the exit button. And that's of course the most simplest thing to do. That's why I saved it for pretty much last. And whenever we click this exit button, we want to say GUI.enabled equals false. Another thing that we want to do is anytime we select a mode, we also want to call the reset selected pets function because we just want to make sure that we reset all the pets that are currently selected. As well as resetting the selected pets, we also want to reset the search bar. So we're going to go to the text box and we're going to set the text of this to just a blank string. Now, if we forget to add this, then whenever a player swaps from say withdrawal to deposit, all the pets could still be selected if we didn't change this. And then also the text in the search bar could still carry over because we didn't reset either of those things. So at least now, anytime we select the mode, that will happen. Anyways, with all that being said, we can actually set the enabled property of the pet bank GUI to false, and then we can start our game and test this out. So hopping directly into our game, we can go ahead, go up to this part and touch it. We can see that the GUI has been activated. If we go to withdraw, we can see that there are currently no pets actually inside of here. So we can click cancel, go back to deposit pets, and then we can just start messing around and selecting any of these that we want to. Additionally, we could say search for a specific pet. So search for the pig, search for the dogs that we have, or anything else like that. Then we can click on deposit 11 pets, and then we can see that the amount text label has been updated right here, as well as the container that's displayed to us has been refreshed with only the pets that it should display. Then we can click cancel and then go back to the main menu, and then we can click on withdraw pets, and then we can see that all the 11 pets are stored right here. So these are the pets that are currently inside of our inventory. If we wanted to, we could select any of these and click on withdraw, and then we can see that that number is updated right there. We can also select all of them, withdraw all of them, and then they should all be added directly back to our inventory. So it seems like the pet bank is functioning perfectly, but if we look in our output, we can actually see that there's some errors right down here. Now these errors are actually coming from the pet's inventory local script inside of that GUI folder, and we should take a look at line 119. Now the errors that you're seeing right here are not actually a big deal. If you don't fix these, you will not have any issue. At least that's what I've seen from doing testing, but we might as well fix it because why not, right? So basically what this error is saying is that right here we have a variable called button, and that's equal to a child that's inside of this container. So most likely it's a text button that has the specific pet's UUID in it, and that's what we're looking for right here. Then after we find that button, it should have a text label on it called pet name. We set the text of that. It should have an image label called equipped. We set the visibility of that, and so on. Now what this error is actually resulting from is that after we try to find the child, when we try to set the pet name, the child has not actually been found. We were not actually able to find that text button inside of the container with that specific UUID. Now that's most likely occurring because we're transferring those from the pet inventory over to the pet bank or vice versa. So how we can easily fix this issue is just by saying if not button, then return end. So if there's been no button actually found, then we're just going to stop the function right there and not do anything. And with that being said, that now fixes that error. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, with that being said, that's going to be it for this episode. As always, if you guys did enjoy or the video did help you out, make sure you smash the like button, also hit the subscribe button, and turn post notifications on so you get notified every time I upload a brand new video. I also have a Patreon. If you guys like to support me and gain access to all the scripts and the game file that I made during this episode, there's a link down below in the description, and you guys are going to check that out. With that being said, I'll see you guys in the next episode.